I've been going back and forth on whether to share this. Maybe someone here has seen something similar or knows what I'm dealing with. I live in what used to be a decent neighborhood on the east side of Detroit. These days, about half the buildings on my block are abandoned, and the city's been talking about demolition for years, but never seems to get around to it. My apartment building is one of maybe 3 that still have tenants. It's not ideal, but the rent's cheap and I'm close to work. I'm a smoker, which I know is stupid at my age, but I've been trying to quit for years with no luck. My apartment's on the 3rd floor, and there's a fire escape outside my bedroom window that I use when I want a cigarette. The landlord doesn't allow smoking inside, and it's easier than going all the way downstairs. Last night, around 11:30, I climbed out onto the fire escape for my usual before-bed smoke. It was a clear night and not too cold for October. From where I sit, I can see directly into the windows of the abandoned apartment building across the street. Most of the windows are boarded up or broken, but a few still have glass. I was about halfway through my cigarette when I noticed movement in one of the 3rd floor windows across from me. At first, I thought it might be squatters. We get homeless people breaking into the empty buildings sometimes, especially when the weather starts turning cold. But this movement was different, too quick and erratic. Whatever it was moved from that window to another one on the same floor, then disappeared. A few seconds later, I saw it again in a window on the 2nd floor. It was covering a lot of ground really fast, but I couldn't get a clear look at what it was. I stubbed out my cigarette and pulled out my phone, thinking I might be able to get a picture. If it was people breaking into the building, maybe I could show it to the cops. But every time I got my camera ready, the thing would duck out of sight or move to a different window. From what I could see, it looked pale, almost white, and it moved in this crazy way I can't describe. Not like a person walking around, but more like it was crawling or climbing from room to room. The way it transitioned between windows made it seem like it was moving along the walls or ceiling inside the building. I watched for probably 20 minutes as this thing moved through different floors and rooms. Sometimes it would disappear for several minutes, and I think it was completely gone. Then suddenly it would appear in a completely different part of the building. A few times I caught glimpses of it outlined against the broken windows, and the shape was definitely not human. I've seen crackheads with more meat on them than this thing, and its arms and legs looked like long toothpicks. At one point, it appeared in a 4th floor window that was directly across from where I was sitting. For maybe 10 seconds, it seemed to be looking right at me. I couldn't make out any facial features in the darkness, but I had this overwhelming feeling that it knew I was watching it. I tried to take a picture during that moment, but my hands were shaking and the image came out as just a dark blur. By the time I steadied my phone for another shot, it had moved on. The strangest part was how it seemed to navigate the building. These abandoned places are full of debris, broken glass, and holes in the floor. But this thing moved through them like it knew the layout perfectly, never seeming to struggle or slow down. It would appear in windows on different floors with no apparent pattern, like it was just exploring or maybe looking for something. Around midnight, the activity stopped. I waited another 30 minutes, but didn't see any more movement. Whatever it was had either left the building or gone deeper inside where I couldn't see it. I've been thinking about it all day, and I can't come up with any reasonable explanation. At first, I wondered if it might be a really large cat. We have feral cats in the neighborhood, but the size and shape were all wrong. It was definitely bigger than any house cat, and the way it moved was too liquidy, like it was being poured out each time it took a step, if that makes sense. I also considered that it might be a person with some kind of illness or disability that affected the way they walk and how they look. But even that doesn't explain how they were getting between floors so quickly, or why they'd be exploring an abandoned building in the middle of the night. The building it was in has been empty for at least 5 years. The city condemned it after a fire on the second floor, and it's been boarded up ever since. I've never seen anyone go in or out of it, not even homeless people. The first floor is completely sealed up, and the fire escapes were removed for safety. I keep getting stuck on how pale it looked. In the brief moments when I could see it clearly, it almost seemed like the streetlight bounced off of it, like it had wet skin or was covered in something shiny. And the way it moved between rooms made it seem it was used to being in complete darkness. I've lived in this neighborhood for 3 years, and I've never seen anything like this before. The abandoned buildings attract rats and stray animals, sure, but nothing that acts the way this thing did. It seemed too smart and confident about its movements. I'm wondering if anyone else in the area has seen something like this. Maybe it's been living in the abandoned buildings for a while, and I just never noticed it before. Or maybe it's something that recently moved into the hood. I'm trying to figure out if this is some kind of animal I'm not familiar with, or if I should be more concerned about having this thing so close to where I live. Any ideas about what it might be would be really helpful. I need somewhere to start looking for answers. I'm planning to keep an eye on that building for the next few nights to see if it comes back. Part of me hopes it doesn't, but another part of me wants to get a better look, so I can figure out what the hell I'm dealing with here. So this happened about 3 months ago, and I'm still not entirely sure how to process it. My buddy Jake and I decided to do some backcountry camping in Olympic National Park. We're both pretty experienced hikers, and we wanted to get away from the beaten path, away from all the tourists and RV campers. We'd done our research and found this remote area about 12 miles from the nearest trailhead, deep in the temperate rainforest section. The hike in took us most of the day. We're talking thick forests, fallen logs everywhere, and barely any clear ground to set up camp. But that's what we wanted, complete isolation. We found a decent clearing near a small creek and set up our tents just before dark. The plan was to stay 3 nights and really disconnect from everything. The first night started off normal enough. We made dinner on Jake's camp stove, had a few beers, and were just enjoying the silence. You don't realize how much background noise there is in civilization until you're sitting in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the sound of water trickling over rocks. Around 10 p.m., we started hearing things moving around in the forest nearby. At first, we figured it was just deer or maybe elk. But whatever it was seemed to be circling our campsite, staying just outside the range of our flashlights. We'd hear branches snapping to our left. Then a few minutes later, the same sound would come from behind us. Jake grabbed his headlamp and swept it through the trees, but we couldn't see anything. The movement would stop whenever we shined our lights toward it, then start up again from a different direction once we turned away. Probably just curious animals, Jake said, but I could tell he was getting a little spooked too. Around midnight, something knocked over our bear canister. We'd positioned it about 50 feet from the tents, hanging from a rope between 2 trees like you're supposed to. But when we went to check on it, the rope had been untied. That kind of freaked us out because bears don't untie knots. We spent about 20 minutes throwing rocks and yelling into the darkness, trying to scare off whatever was messing with our camp. Eventually, things went quiet and stayed that way for the rest of the night. The next morning, we discovered that a bunch of our stuff had gone missing. Small things mostly. Jake's spare headlamp, a bag of trail mix, and one of my camp socks that had hung up to dry. That was weird because more valuable items were left completely alone. My GPS unit was sitting right where I'd left it, and our phones were untouched. We talked about packing up and heading out, but we'd hiked 12 miles to get there, and it felt stupid to bail after one night of weird animal activity. We figured we'd give it one more night and be more careful about securing our gear. The second day was actually pretty great. We did some fishing in the creek, explored the area, and found this amazing waterfall about a mile upstream from our camp. The forest was beautiful, massive Douglas firs and western red cedars, everything covered in this thick green moss that made it feel like you were walking through a fairy tale. We made it back to camp around 5 p.m. and started preparing dinner. That's when we saw him. Jake spotted him first. He was crouched behind a fallen log about 100 feet away, just watching us. At first glance, I thought it was another camper, maybe someone who'd gotten lost. But as we got a better look, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. This guy was completely naked, even though it was probably 45 degrees out. His hair was long and matted, and his skin was covered in dirt and what looked like scars or scratches. But the most disturbing thing was how thin he was. I mean, dangerously thin, like he hadn't eaten properly in months. His ribs were clearly visible, and his limbs looked like sticks. He was just squatting there, perfectly still, lasered in on us. "Hey," Jake called out. "You okay over there?" The guy didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that Jake had spoken. He just kept staring. We approached slowly, hands visible, trying to look non-threatening. I was thinking maybe this was someone who'd gotten lost and was suffering from exposure or dehydration. But as we got closer, I started noticing more details that didn't sit right. His fingernails were grown out long and looked like they'd been filed to points. His teeth, when he finally opened his mouth, were stained dark and seemed sharper than normal. And his eyes, there was something feral about them, like looking at a wild animal that was deciding whether you were food or a threat. When we were about 50 feet away, he suddenly stood up. This guy had to be at least 6.5 feet tall, but he probably weighed 130 pounds soaking wet. He let out this guttural sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a scream. That's when Jake picked up a rock and threw it in his direction, not trying to hit him, but trying to scare him off. The rock landed about 10 feet short, and the guy immediately grabbed a handful of stones and started hurling them back at us. Now we're in this ridiculous standoff, 3 grown men throwing rocks at each other like we're in elementary school. But this guy had serious aim and was putting some real force behind his throws. One rock caught Jake in the shoulder hard enough to leave a bruise. The whole thing probably lasted 5 minutes, with us slowly backing toward our camp and him advancing, still throwing anything he could get his hands on. He moved in this weird crouched position, like he was more comfortable on all fours than standing upright. Finally, Jake grabbed a bigger rock, probably the size of a softball, and really let it fly. It didn't hit the guy, but it landed close enough that he got the message. He let out another one of those disturbing screams and took off into the forest, moving faster than anyone that malnourished should have been able to move. We broke camp immediately, didn't even bother with dinner or cleaning up properly. We just stuffed everything into our packs and started hiking out, even though we only had a couple of hours of daylight left. Neither of us wanted to spend another night in those woods. The hike out was tense. Every snapping branch or rustling bush had us spinning around, expecting to see that guy following us. We made it back to the trailhead around 11 p.m., hiking the last few miles by headlamp. During the drive home, we tried to make sense of what we'd encountered. Jake thought maybe it was someone with severe mental illness who'd been living rough in the woods. I wondered if it could have been a meth addict or someone on other drugs that had affected the behavior and appearance. But neither explanation really fits what we saw. This guy seemed too adapted to forest life, too comfortable moving through the wilderness. And the way he threw those rocks suggested he'd been doing it for a long time. We reported it to the park rangers when we got back to civilization, but I got the feeling that they weren't too surprised. The ranger I talked to asked a few specific questions about the location and the guy's appearance, like he'd heard similar stories before. I haven't been back to Olympic since then. Jake wants to try a different section of the park next summer, but honestly, I'm not sure I'm ready for that yet. There's something about knowing that there are people living wild in those forests that changes how safe you feel out there. We never did figure out what happened to our missing gear from the first night, but I have a pretty good idea now. My husband Jake is coming home from his training exercise on Friday, and I keep going back and forth on whether I should tell him what happened this week. Part of me thinks he'll worry, especially since he can't do anything about it from 3 states away. But another part of me feels like I'm going crazy keeping this to myself. I don't know, maybe this is some kind of postpartum thing. We live in a ranch house on Maple Street, right at the edge of town where the suburbs meet the state forest. It's the kind of place where you get the best of both worlds, close enough to town for good schools and grocery stores, but far enough out that we have a big backyard and actual privacy. The forest starts maybe 50 feet behind our fence line, and during the day you can see deer and sometimes a fox wandering through. Jake's been gone for 2 weeks doing some kind of training exercise with his National Guard unit. Something about winter survival skills up in Minnesota. It's just me and Emma, our 5-month-old daughter, holding down the fort. I'm used to him being away. He's deployed twice since we got married. But being alone with a baby is different than being alone by yourself. Anyways, the first incident happened this past Monday night. I just put Emma down around 8:30 and was getting ready to watch Netflix when I heard a racket outside. It sounded like something was getting into our trash cans, which wasn't unusual. We've had problems with raccoons before, and I figured they were back. I grabbed a flashlight and went out through the back door to scare them off. The trash cans are on the side of the house, between us and our neighbors. As soon as I stepped outside, I heard something scrambling around the corner toward the backyard. I followed the sound with my flashlight, expecting to see a couple of masked bandits running for the trees. Instead, I caught a glimpse of something pale and reflective, disappearing into the tree line. It was moving fast and on all fours, but it seemed way too big to be a raccoon. My first thought was it might be a dog, maybe one that had gotten loose and was scavenging. But the way it moved was weird. It was too fluid, almost like it was flowing across the ground. The trash cans were knocked over and garbage was scattered everywhere, but that's normal raccoon behavior. I cleaned up the mess and went back inside, figuring it was just a bigger animal than usual. Maybe a sick coyote or something. Tuesday night was completely quiet. Emma slept through the night for once, and I actually got 8 hours of sleep. I was starting to think whatever it was had moved on. Then Wednesday night, around 11 p.m., I heard the noise again. This time it sounded like it was coming from the backyard instead of the side yard. Emma was still awake. She had taken a long nap that afternoon. So I waited until she finally dozed off before going to investigate. This time I grabbed Jake's Glock from the gun safe. I know that might sound a little like overkill for dealing with a raccoon, but something about Monday night had left me uneasy. The way that thing moved didn't sit right with me, and with Jake gone, I wasn't taking any chances. I crept out the back door as quietly as I could, using the flashlight app on my phone. The trash cans were knocked over again, but this time I could hear something actively moving around back there. Not the quick, skittish movements you'd expect from a raccoon caught in the act. It was slower. I rounded the corner of the house and froze. There was something crouched next to our fence, maybe 30 feet away. It was pale, almost white, and completely hairless. At first glance, it looked vaguely human-shaped, but it looked gross. The arms and legs were wiry, like someone had stretched a person on a medieval rack. It was on all fours, but its back was arched high in the air, giving it this spider kind of silhouette. It was eating something from a torn garbage bag, making these wet smacking sounds that made me sick to my stomach. I could see its spine straight through its skin. I would have been able to count each one like bumps along its back. I stood there for probably 10 seconds, trying to process what I was looking at. It hadn't noticed me yet. Part of my brain was still trying to figure out what it was. Maybe it was a sick deer or someone's dog with a skin condition. But part of me also knew that this wasn't any animal I'd ever seen. I just didn't want to believe it yet. I raised the gun and called out, "Hey." The thing's head snapped up immediately, and for a split second, I saw its face in my phone's light. That image has now been burned into my head. It looked almost human, if a human was made out of shiny white plastic. The eyes were too large though, and set too far apart, and its mouth was hanging open, showing teeth that were way too sharp. I fired once, more to scare it than anything else. I'm a decent shot, but I was shaking pretty badly. The bullet probably went wide by 10 feet. Don't worry, no one lives behind us for miles, and camping isn't permitted in that area. I was scared, not stupid. The thing let out this hissing sound and took off toward the back fence. It didn't run like a normal animal. It moved in this flowing, loping gait that covered ground incredibly fast. Within seconds, it had cleared our 6-foot fence like it was nothing and disappeared into the trees. I stood there for another few minutes, dazed and bewildered, before I realized how lucky I was that none of the neighbors called the police about the gunshot. The next door neighbors are older and probably sleep with their hearing aids out, and the house on the other side has been empty since last month. I cleaned up the scattered trash and went back inside, but I didn't sleep well that night. Every little sound had me jumping. I kept thinking about how effortlessly that thing had moved, and how it seemed to have no fear of humans until I actually fired at it. Thursday night, I was determined to stay inside no matter what I heard. Emma was finally sleeping better, and I moved her crib into our bedroom just in case. Around 1 a.m., I heard scratching sounds coming from the front of the house. I crept to the living room window and peeked through the blinds. My car was parked in the driveway, and there was something circling it. The streetlight gave me a pretty clear view this time. It was definitely the same thing from Wednesday night. Pale, hairless, and moving on all fours with those extremely long limbs. It was checking out my Honda, like it was curious about it. It would crouch next to a wheel for a few seconds, then move to another part of the car. At one point, it reared up on its hind legs and pressed its hands against the driver's side window, looking inside. Standing upright like that, the thing had to be at least 7 feet tall. Its arms hung down past its knees, and I could see that its fingers were way too long. It stayed in that position for maybe a minute, simply looking into my car, before dropping back down and going back to its routine. I watched it circle the car 3 or 4 times, before it finally lost interest and ran off down Maple Street toward the main road. I kept watching until it disappeared around the corner, then stayed at the window for another hour making sure it didn't come back. That was 3 nights ago, and I haven't seen it since. I've been keeping all the lights on after dark, and checking the locks obsessively. Emma seems to sense my anxiety. She's been fussier than usual and won't settle down unless I'm holding her. I've been trying to research what I might have seen, but I'm not finding anything that matches. The closest thing is something called a crawler that people talk about online, but most of those stories sound pretty made up. There are also some Native American legends about pale humanoid creatures that live in forests, but I don't know enough about local folklore to say if it's that relevant. But I know I saw something. I know how it made my skin crawl just looking at it. And I know that whatever it was, it didn't belong in our neighborhood. Jake gets back Friday afternoon, and I can't wait. Even if I don't tell him the whole story, just having him here will make me feel safer. He's good in crisis situations. Comes with the military training, I guess. And he's got better night vision than me, so maybe he'd be able to spot this thing if it comes back. The weird thing is, I almost feel bad for whatever it was. It seemed more curious than aggressive, like it was just trying to understand our world. When it was looking in my car, there was something almost childlike about its behavior. But then I remember those teeth and that horrible hissing sound, and I remind myself that curiosity doesn't mean harmless. I've been keeping the gun closer than usual, and I've started parking in the garage instead of the driveway. I also moved Emma's nightlight to the window facing the backyard, thinking maybe the extra light would discourage visitors. Part of me hopes I never see it again, but another part of me wonders where it came from, and if there are others out there in the forest. Our development was built in the 90s on land that used to be completely wild. Maybe we're the ones encroaching on its territory. Either way, I'll be a lot happier when Jake gets home. Some problems are easier to face when you're not alone with a baby in a house that backs up to thousands of acres of dark woods. I just hope it doesn't come back before Friday. This happened about 6 months ago, in February, up in northern Wisconsin. I know how this is going to sound, but I swear on my life this is exactly what happened. Also, for what it's worth, I don't do drugs. So, some background information first. I'd been going through a rough divorce and needed to get away from everything for a while. My Uncle Frank had left me his hunting cabin when he passed away, and I figured a week of isolation might help clear my head. The place is about 20 miles outside of Hayward, way back in the woods on the edge of a small lake. There are no neighbors for miles. Also, I'm a pretty rational guy. I work in IT and I don't believe in ghosts or Bigfoot or any of that stuff. But what I experienced up there has me questioning everything I thought I knew. The first few days were fine, peaceful even. I read, chopped firewood, and took walks around the frozen lake. The cabin has a generator for power, but I mostly just used oil lamps in the fireplace. It was exactly the kind of quiet I needed. On the fourth night around 10 p.m., I heard something outside. At first I thought it was just branches creaking in the wind, but it sounded too consistent, like footsteps but with this weird spacing between them, almost as if whoever was out there was jumping or something. I looked out the window but couldn't see anything past the porch light. The next morning on my way down to the lake, I found tracks in the snow. They started at the tree line and circled the entire cabin, staying just outside the light. They looked almost human, but elongated and way too big, like size 20 feet but narrower. And the stride length was insane, probably 6 or 7 feet between prints. I figured it might be someone messing with me, maybe local kids or something. So that night I made sure to keep more lights on and had my phone ready to take pictures if I saw anything. Around midnight, the temperature inside the cabin suddenly dropped. I'm talking about a 20-degree difference in maybe 5 minutes. My breath started fogging up and I had to throw more logs on the fire. That's when I heard my name being called from outside. The voice sounded exactly like my ex-wife Sarah. Same tone, same way she used to call for me when she got home. I mean from when we were first married, not right before the divorce. It was soft and caring. But Sarah was back in Milwaukee and didn't even know where this cabin was. I'd never told her about Uncle Frank. "David? David, are you in there?" the voice said. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the window, standing about 50 feet away. Just at the edge of where my light reached was a figure. It was really tall and thin in a way that didn't look right, like someone had stretched a person vertically. "I've been driving for hours, David. I'm so cold. Can you let me in?" The voice was perfect. If I had known better, I would have sworn it was Sarah. But as my eyes adjusted, I could see that whatever was out there definitely wasn't human. The limbs were too long, and it was standing in a weird hunched position, like it wasn't used to being upright. I yelled through the window that I knew it wasn't Sarah and that it needed to leave. The thing went completely silent for about 30 seconds. Then it started laughing. It wasn't Sarah's laugh. This was something else entirely, low and raspy like air being forced through a damaged throat. The sound made my skin crawl. "David knows," it said, but the voice had changed. It was deeper now and more guttural. "David is smart." I could see it moving closer, but not walking normally. It was moving on all fours, with those impossibly long arms reaching forward to pull itself through the snow. Even crouched down like that, it had to be at least 7 feet tall. I'd brought Uncle Frank's old hunting rifle with me, more for bears than anything else. I loaded it and pointed it at the window, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. The thing stopped advancing when it reached the porch steps, maybe 20 feet away. Up close, I could see its face clearly in the porch light. It was the most disturbing thing I've ever seen. Imagine a human face that's been stretched and distorted, with skin pulled so tight you can see every bone underneath. The eyes were sunken way back in the skull, just dark holes. And the mouth, hell, the mouth was way too wide, stretching almost from ear to ear. It stayed there for maybe 10 minutes, just staring at me through the window. I kept the rifle trained on it, but honestly, I was shaking so bad I probably couldn't have hit anything. Then it spoke again, but this time in my voice. "Sarah, please don't leave me," it said, perfectly mimicking something I'd said during one of our last fights. "I can change. I'll be better." Something in me kind of shattered. Hearing my own desperate words coming from that thing's mouth made me realize how pathetic I must have sounded to Sarah. I fired twice through the window. The glass shattered and the thing let out a shriek that I can't even describe. It sounded like metal scraping against bone. By the time I got to the broken window with my flashlight, it was gone. No sign of it except for those massive tracks leading back into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. After patching the window as best I could, I sat by the fire with the rifle across my lap until dawn, listening for any other sounds outside. When the sun came up, I packed my stuff and got out of there fast. I replayed what happened in my head on the way back. Maybe it was a bear with mange. Maybe the isolation and stress had caused some kind of hallucination. Maybe I'd been drinking more than I thought. But none of that sat well with me. When I got home, I started researching. I read everything I could find about unusual animal sightings in northern Wisconsin. That's when I came across the Wendigo legends. According to the Ojibwe folklore, A Wendigo is created when a person resorts to cannibalism during extreme starvation. The act transforms them into something that's no longer human, a creature with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. The descriptions matched what I'd seen perfectly: impossibly tall and thin, with elongated limbs and the ability to mimic human voices. They're supposed to be drawn to isolated areas and prey on people who are alone and vulnerable. I did some digging into Uncle Frank's history with that cabin. Turns out he bought it from a family back in 1987, after their teenage son had went missing during a winter camping trip. The kid's body was never found, but search teams reported finding unusual tracks in the snow around their last campsite. I also found a newspaper article from 1952 about a trapper who disappeared near that same lake. His cabin was found with the door torn off its hinges, and there was blood on the walls but no body. The article mentioned that local Ojibwe guides refused to help with the search, claiming the area was cursed by hunger. I haven't been back to that cabin, and I don't plan to. I put it up for sale, but so far there's been no buyers. Maybe that's for the best. You have been watching Neon Noir, a Radion production brought to you by Trapper Dan, the finest in canned survival food.